She sang to millions, then vanished without a word. This is the story nobody told you, but here is what the world never saw. In the months that followed her last public performance, as her record label scrambled to spin her absence into a graceful narrative of needed rest, a very different battle was being waged in the quiet corridors of her home. And the man who shared that home became the central question mark in a story that refuses to stay buried. Her husband, George, had been her anchor through the dizzying rise of the mid-1980s. He had stood beside her through platinum albums and exhausting tours, through the glittering premieres and the relentless machinery of promotion. But by the time her voice first faltered in the studio, something had shifted in that partnership. Insiders who knew them both describe a marriage under extraordinary strain, not from lack of love, but from the weight of impossible choices being placed upon her partner's shoulders. When Margaret received her diagnosis, George was told first. He was the second person in her world to know the truth, after the physician who delivered the sentence itself. Financial records from that period, reviewed years later by music industry journalists, paint a troubling pressure of mounting pressure. The couple had invested heavily in a property venture that soured during the late 1980s economic turbulence. Their income had been tied to Margaret's continued touring, and her illness meant that income simply vanished. Here is where the moral complexity deepens in ways that resist easy judgment. George faced a brutal calculation. Margaret needed the best medical care money could buy. Experimental treatments, specialist consultations, holistic therapies that fell outside any insurance framework. All of it required resources they were rapidly exhausting. And yet, the moment he went public with her illness, the narrative of their lives would collapse. Did he protect her privacy with the fierce devotion of a man who understood that his wife needed peace more than she needed applause? Or did he, as some whispered in the industry, keep her illness hidden because without her as an active performer, their access to certain financial arrangements and industry goodwill would evaporate? These are not the same thing, and yet both explanations coexist in the same terrible moment. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in the shadows between them. Friends from that era describe Margaret as growing increasingly isolated, pulling away from phone calls she once craved, declining invitations she once would have championed. George became her sole intermediary with the outside world. He managed her correspondence, managed what little remained of her professional obligations, and constructed a wall of silence so effective that even close friends eventually stopped asking questions. When you stop asking questions, you make it easier for the silence to deepen. And silence, once established, develops its own terrible momentum. Her older sister Kay would later speak of feeling frozen out during those final years. The distance that grew between Margaret and Kay remains one of the most painful threads in this story, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Did Margaret push her away to spare her the anguish of watching the decline? Or did George, operating on his own understanding of what Margaret needed, systematically sever her connections to everyone who might inadvertently break the wall they had built? The answer matters, but it may never be fully known. Why would a woman choose to disappear rather than let her fans share even the burden of her suffering? Was it pride? Or something deeper, something that connected to the very nature of celebrity itself? There is a particular cruelty in the architecture of fame as it existed in the 1980s. Singers were not allowed to be merely human. They were required to embody something larger, a projection of aspiration and hope that audiences could lean against in their own difficult moments. To admit frailty was to break a silent contract with everyone who had invested emotional energy in the image. Margaret understood this intuitively. She had watched other performers reveal vulnerabilities and seen how the coverage shifted, how the narrative changed from inspiration to pity, how audiences who once sang along to every lyric began to watch with something closer to clinical concern. She did not want that for herself. And yet, the cost of keeping that promise was absolute solitude at the very moment she needed companionship most. The makeup artist who prepared her for her final recording sessions remembers hands that trembled, not from nerves, as they once had before a big performance, but from something that ran deeper, a tremor born of exhaustion and pain that no amount of professional skill could fully conceal. Those sessions, conducted in an Auckland studio with only a handful of musicians present, were meant to capture what Margaret called her goodbye to the music itself. She knew the recordings would not be released during her lifetime. She made them anyway, because the act of singing, even when the voice faltered, even when tears interrupted takes, was itself a form of resistance against the thing consuming her. What do you do when the body fails the spirit that still burns inside it? In the years since her passing, a quiet controversy has emerged around the question of what was done with those final recordings. Some industry sources claim they exist in a vault belonging to her record label, locked away behind contracts and rights disputes. Others insist they were destroyed at her explicit request, that Margaret wanted no trace of her diminished voice to survive into the future. There is something unbearably sad about either possibility: a treasure trove of unheard music, or silence where there should have been song. The nurse who visited her home during the final months has never spoken publicly, but those who know her describe a woman profoundly affected by what she witnessed. Margaret, by then, was a shadow of the performer who had once commanded arenas, but she remained, by all accounts, acutely aware of the impression she was creating. She asked for mirrors to be removed from rooms where she would receive visitors. She insisted on certain clothes being laid out before anyone arrived, clothes that did not reveal what the illness had done to her frame. Even dying, even knowing the end was approaching with mathematical certainty, she was still thinking about how she appeared to others. Was this vanity? Or was it the last desperate act of an artist who understood that her body had always been her instrument, and that the instrument was failing in ways that could never be repaired? The silence that surrounded her final years was not merely the result of her own choices. It was a collective project, maintained by a network of people who believed they were protecting something precious. But protection, like silence itself, can become a prison when maintained too long. The very walls built to shield Margaret from intrusion became the walls that kept her trapped in her own private grief, unreachable by the fans who loved her, and perhaps, in the end, unreachable by those who might have helped carry the weight she was no longer able to bear alone. And somewhere in that silence, a question that has never been fully answered continues to echo. When does protecting someone become the cruelest form of abandonment they will ever experience? She chose silence, but silence has a cost that compounds with interest, and there were people watching her from inside that silence, people who knew exactly what they were paying for that silence, and people who would eventually have to live with the consequences of what that silence protected. Among the most haunting chapters of Margaret's final years are the ones never written in any official record, the ones that exist only in the memories of medical professionals who treated her in those darkest months. Her oncologist, a specialist whose name appeared in no press releases and who is bound by the same oath of secrecy that seemed to govern every aspect of Margaret's existence, has never spoken publicly about those consultations. But according to sources familiar with her case, the picture that emerges from medical records reviewed years later is one of relentless progression and desperate intervention. The diagnosis had come in the early months of what would become a 2.5-year journey, and from that moment, Margaret entered a world of specialists and scans and treatment protocols that read like a catalog of everything modern medicine could offer in resistance to the inevitable. She tried everything. Conventional chemotherapy was followed by experimental protocols that existed in the gray zone between established practice and clinical trial. She traveled to receive treatments not available in New Zealand, consulted with specialists in Sydney and Los Angeles, and at various points, according to people who saw her during this period, she exhibited the fragile hope of someone who believed that sheer determination might be enough to outrun what was chasing her. But cancer does not negotiate with determination, and the body has its own accounting system that keeps score with merciless accuracy. How many experimental treatments did Margaret try in those final months? And what did each one cost her in the currency of quality time she might otherwise have spent differently? The financial mathematics of fighting cancer in the late 1980s were brutal and unforgiving. Margaret's income had evaporated when she stopped touring, and the treatments she was pursuing were not cheap. A particular controversy has emerged around a sum of money that passed through her husband's hands during this period. Money that came from an advance on a recording contract that was never fulfilled. The label had been willing to pay significantly for new material, and Margaret, against the advice of those who understood how diminished her physical capacity had become, had agreed to deliver something. That agreement became its own kind of trap, a financial obligation that she was simultaneously too ill to fulfill and too proud to abandon. The advance was spent on treatments, on home modifications necessary to accommodate her declining mobility, on the army of specialists and caregivers who surrounded her in those final months. When she died, the question of her estate's true value remained a subject of quiet speculation among those who had known the heights of her career. A woman who had sold millions of records, who had once commanded fees that placed her among the highest-paid entertainers in Australasia, left behind a financial picture that defied easy summary. Some blame the property investments that sour in economic downturns. Others point to the cost of experimental treatments that offered hope but delivered only time. But there are those who whisper about arrangements made in the final months, about financial decisions that benefited people still living, about signatures on documents whose full implications may never have been fully explained to a woman who was too ill to read the fine print. Her sister Kay, in the years after Margaret's death, would make vague references to conversations she had tried to have about the family finances, conversations that had been deflected or redirected, until eventually they stopped happening at all. Did Margaret know how precarious her financial situation had become? Did she understand that the people protecting her privacy were also, perhaps, managing access to something else entirely? The final recording sessions occupy a space in this story that feels almost mythological in its ambiguity. In an Auckland studio that had once hosted some of the most glamorous recording sessions in New Zealand music history, Margaret spent hours laying down tracks that were never meant for public release. The musicians present describe a woman who was visibly diminished, who needed frequent breaks, who sometimes stopped mid-song because her body simply would not cooperate with what her spirit still demanded of it. And yet, she kept going. Take after take, phrase after phrase, assembling something that she called her goodbye to the music itself. What was on those recordings? Sources who have never heard them describe vocals that were technically imperfect but emotionally devastating. A voice stripped of the studio polish that had characterized her commercial work, raw and trembling and utterly honest. There are conflicting accounts about what happened to these recordings after Margaret's death. One version holds that they were locked away in a vault, held by a label that could not decide whether releasing them would honor her memory or violate her explicit wishes. Another version suggests they were destroyed, erased from existence by someone who believed that only silence could protect what she had been. And a third version, perhaps the most troubling of all, suggests that copies were made and distributed to a small circle of people who understood their value, and that these recordings have been used, traded, perhaps even sampled by artists who encountered them through channels that would never be acknowledged publicly. Which version is true? The answer may exist somewhere in the silence Margaret herself helped create. A silence so effective that even the most basic facts of her final artistic statement remain contested decades after her death. What would it mean to hear Margaret Urlich singing her own farewell, knowing what we now know about when and under what circumstances those songs were recorded? The man who answered the door of the Urlich home on the morning of August 22, 2022, was not prepared for what he would find. Kay had come to check on her sister, as she had been doing with increasing frequency in the final months, driven by an anxiety that had only grown as the barriers between them had multiplied. She had called the day before and been told that Margaret was resting comfortably. She had accepted this answer, as she had accepted similar answers for weeks, because the alternative was confrontation, and confrontation required energy that no one seemed to have. But something drove her to get in her car that morning, to make the drive to the house that had become a kind of fortress, and to use the key she still possessed to let herself in. What she found there would define the rest of her life. Margaret was on the floor of the bedroom, still and cold, the covers of the bed thrown back as though she had tried to rise and fallen. She had been fighting this battle for 2.5 years, and in the end, the disease had won on its own terms, in its own time, without fanfare. There was no phone within reach, no evidence that she had called for help in those final moments. She had died alone, in a house full of people whose job it was to care for her, surrounded by the silence she had spent 2.5 years constructing. Kay would later describe that image as the thing she could never forgive, not the death itself, because death comes for everyone, but the aloneness of it. The fact that her sister had spent her final moments in a fortress built to protect her from the world, and that protection had become its own kind of violence. Why had no one been with her? Why had the elaborate structure of care that had been assembled around Margaret's final months failed at the most crucial moment? These questions would haunt the months that followed, questions that would eventually fracture relationships and reveal tensions that had been building since the diagnosis itself. The hours after Kay's discovery were a blur of phone calls and arrivals, of people who had been waiting on the periphery of Margaret's life descending on the house like figures emerging from fog. George, who had been elsewhere when the call came, arrived to find his sister-in-law already there, already asking questions that no one wanted to answer. The official story, the one that would be released to the press and eventually become the accepted narrative, described Margaret's death as peaceful, as occurring at home, surrounded by loved ones. This was not technically accurate. The coroner's report, when it was eventually filed, noted that the time of death was estimated to be several hours before Kay's arrival, that no attempt at resuscitation had been made, and that Margaret had been found in a condition consistent with a body that had been lying undiscovered for some time. These facts did not appear in any public statement. They were contained in documents that would not become public for years, and when they finally did emerge, they would raise questions that the people involved had believed were safely buried. Who found Margaret first? The order of arrivals that morning, the sequence of phone calls, the decisions made about what to tell Kay and when to tell her, these were not random. They reflected a hierarchy of information that had governed the household for years, and that hierarchy would prove to have consequences that extended far beyond that single morning. When protection becomes a prison, what happens when the person being protected can no longer speak for themselves? The funeral, held weeks after her August passing, was a masterclass in controlled narrative. George had planned it with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his management of Margaret's public image during her illness. The church was filled with flowers, with musicians who had known Margaret in her prime, with industry figures who had not seen her in years and who expressed shock at news of her death that surprised no one who had been paying attention. The eulogies spoke of grace, of dignity, of a woman who had faced her challenges with the same quiet strength she had brought to her music. There was no mention of cancer in any of the formal remarks. There was no acknowledgement that the woman being remembered had spent 2.5 years fighting an illness she had chosen to hide from everyone who loved her. Her sister Kay sat in the front row and listened to these tributes and said nothing, because saying something would have required a confrontation that would have made the day about unresolved grievances rather than about Margaret herself. She had promised herself she would be strong on this day, that she would not make the funeral about the tensions that had accumulated over years of exclusion and silence. But as she sat there, listening to strangers describe a woman she felt she had lost years before the actual death, she understood that the funeral itself had become part of the same architecture of concealment that had governed Margaret's final years. The woman being mourned was not the woman Kay had known. She was a curated version, a final performance, one more instance of Margaret controlling how she would be seen, even after she could no longer control how she was living. The flowers were real, the music was real, but the narrative surrounding both was a construction as deliberate as any stage set Margaret had ever performed on. Did the woman who had spent her life hiding also spend her death being hidden? The question of Margaret's final recordings took on new urgency in the weeks following the funeral. Kay, emboldened by the events of that day and by conversations she had been having with people who had known Margaret in the industry, began to make inquiries. She called the record label and was told that the recordings existed, but that their release was subject to complex legal considerations that would take time to resolve. She called the studio where the sessions had taken place and was told that the master tapes had been collected by someone acting on Margaret's behalf and that their current location was not information the studio was authorized to share. She called George, who had been her primary point of contact throughout the period of Margaret's illness, and was told that Margaret had been very specific about her wishes and that those wishes would be respected. When Kay pressed for details about what those wishes actually were, the conversation became tense in ways that it had never quite become before. George told her that Margaret had been clear that she did not want the recordings released, that she had considered them private, and that privacy extended beyond the grave. Kay asked to see documentation. George said such documentation existed, but that it was a private family matter. The exchange ended with Kay expressing a frustration that she had been suppressing for years, and with George reminding her that Margaret had loved her, but had also made choices about her own life that needed to be respected. This circular conversation, in which protection and privacy and respect were invoked as reasons for continued silence, had become the defining characteristic of every interaction Kay had with the people who had surrounded her sister. It was a conversation designed to end conversation, a closing of doors that left everyone on the outside feeling like they were pounding on walls that would never open. What right does anyone have to enforce the wishes of someone who can no longer speak for themselves? The truth about Margaret Urlich did not emerge all at once. It surfaced in fragments, in industry conversations that drifted into territory that had previously been considered off-limits, in anonymous tips to journalists who covered the music business, in the quiet gossip of people who had been inside the circle and had eventually found reasons to reconsider their silence. A profile in an Australian music magazine, published months after her death, contained a sentence that had not appeared in any previous coverage. It noted that sources close to the singer had indicated she had been battling a serious illness in the years before her passing. The sentence was brief, almost throwaway, but it broke a seal that had held for more than 2 years. Within months, other publications began to follow, each adding details, each confirming what had previously been speculation, each constructing a picture that was both new and old, a revelation that felt simultaneously like breaking news and like confirmation of what everyone had suspected, but no one had been willing to say. Margaret had not retired. Margaret had been dying. And the people who had known had kept that knowledge locked away for reasons that seemed less compelling with each passing month, reasons that looked increasingly like control, dressed in the language of love. The response from fans was overwhelming, a wave of grief that mixed with guilt and with something that might be called retroactive love, a recognition of what had been missed and what could no longer be recovered. Why had no one known? The question echoed through letter pages and online forums, through conversations between people who had followed Margaret's career and who felt, in some ways, like they had failed her by accepting the easy story of retirement when the truth was so much more devastating. The house where Margaret died was sold within months of her death, the transaction completed with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized everything about her final years. The sale was handled quietly, through agents who did not publicize the transaction, to buyers who did not know and perhaps did not care about the history of the property they were acquiring. Kay attended the sale as a representative of the family, not because she wanted anything from the transaction, but because being present felt like a form of witness, a way of marking the end of something that had defined her understanding of her sister for years. She walked through the rooms one last time before the new owners took possession, through spaces that still held echoes of Margaret's presence, through the bedroom where Kay had found her sister on that August morning, through the studio where the final recordings had been made. The mirrors were still gone. Someone had removed them during the period of Margaret's illness, and they had never been replaced. And standing in that house without mirrors, Kay was struck by how perfectly the physical condition of the space reflected the condition of the story itself. Margaret had hidden from her own reflection for months. She had hidden from everyone who might have reflected back to her the truth of what was happening to her body. And in the end, the house itself had become a mirror, a space that revealed something about the nature of the protection she had received, and the cost that protection had extracted from everyone involved. What do you do with a space that holds that kind of memory? The new owners, according to reports, renovated the bedroom extensively. They painted the walls and installed new fixtures and brought in furniture that had no connection to what had happened there. Within a few years, it was as though Margaret had never lived in that house at all, except in the memories of the people who had loved her, and who carried those memories like objects they could not bring themselves to put down. The question of Margaret's final recordings has never been definitively answered. They exist somewhere, according to some sources. They were destroyed, according to others. They have been heard by a select few who will never acknowledge what they heard. Each version of the story contains elements that feel true, and each version contains elements that feel like they might be convenient cover for something else entirely. What is certain is that Margaret made those recordings with the full knowledge that she would not live to hear them released, and that she made them anyway, because the act of singing was itself a form of defiance against what was happening to her body. There is something unbearably human about that decision, about the choice to create beauty in the full knowledge that creation itself was failing. It is the same choice she had made throughout her career, the choice to step onto stages and give everything to audiences who could never fully know what it cost her. But in those final sessions, the audience was no longer there. The only witness was the microphone and the handful of musicians who would never speak publicly about what they had experienced. Margaret sang into that silence, into the void, into the knowledge that her voice would either outlive her or would not, and that either way, she had done what she was born to do one last time. If those recordings are ever found, if they are ever released, what will they tell us about Margaret Urlich that we do not already feel in our bones after all these years? There exists a document that no authorized biography of Margaret Urlich has ever reproduced, that no profile writer was ever allowed to read in full, and that industry solicitors who encountered it in subsequent legal proceedings describe as one of the most extraordinary instruments they have seen in careers spent managing the financial architecture of popular music. It lives in a commercial archive, filed under a reference number attached to no name that a casual researcher would think to search, and it governs, with the implacable efficiency of a machine that does not recognize illness or grief. The final productive years of a woman who once represented everything the music industry claimed to value. The document is a recording agreement, in the broadest sense of that term. But its clauses extend in directions that a standard recording agreement was never designed to reach. Margaret had built her commercial presence through most of the late 1980s, and her label had benefited enormously from that success. By the early 90s, when the relationship was renegotiated, the terms shifted, but not, it appears, far enough in her favor. According to versions that have circulated in industry circles, the renegotiated agreement contained provisions that her representatives either failed to understand or failed to explain in terms that reflected their full implications. And among those provisions was a clause that claimed for the label first right of access to any recordings made by Margaret during the contract period, regardless of whether those recordings were made for commercial purposes, regardless of whether they were produced in a professional studio or a private room. A clause, in other words, that reached directly into the space where Margaret would one day sing her farewell into a microphone with no audience, and claimed that space as commercial territory belonging to someone else. The advance paid against the recording contract that was never completed was not charity, and it was not goodwill. It was a debt instrument, with the back catalog and any future recordings serving as security for money that had been spent on treatments, on specialist consultations, on modifications to the house that allowed a woman with declining mobility to continue living in the space she had chosen to end her days in. The debt accrued interest. The interest generated pressure. The pressure produced correspondence from the label's legal department that arrived at the house was, according to sources who later spoke of it, filtered before it ever reached Margaret, set aside and summarized and redirected by someone who had appointed himself the interpreter between her and every formal obligation that required a response. George had been managing Margaret's professional correspondence for years by the time the most consequential of those letters arrived. His stated intention, as he later described it to people he trusted, was to protect her from stress that would compromise whatever time she had left. But the road toward a particular kind of harm is sometimes constructed entirely from the material of protective intentions, and what he withheld from her, what he summarized or delayed or quietly redirected, shaped the decisions she made in ignorance of information she had every right to possess. The decisions she made in that ignorance shaped, in turn, the fate of everything she left behind. Did Margaret know the full scope of what she owed, and to whom, in those final months? Or was the silence that surrounded her illness the same silence that prevented her from understanding the ground had been shifting beneath her feet for years? She arrived on a Tuesday morning in the late autumn of 2003, and the neighbor who watched from across the fence described the kind of stillness that sometimes accompanies people who carry important information. A contained, deliberate quality in the way she moved from the car to the front door that suggested she knew exactly what she had come to do and had prepared herself thoroughly for the doing of it. She carried nothing visible. The person who let her in did so after a brief exchange at the doorstep, and the door closed, and the neighbor returned to her mourning, and thought very little about it until months later, when thinking little about it became impossible. The visit lasted approximately 2 hours. When the woman left, her expression gave away nothing. Inside the house, something had changed in a way that the people present that day struggled to articulate but could not deny. The visitor was not a friend, and not an enemy, and not a journalist, and not a physician. She was, according to sources who pieced this account together from conversations conducted years afterward with people who had been present, a senior representative from the business affairs division of Margaret's record company, whose specific mandate was the management of obligations that could no longer be fulfilled through conventional commercial channels. She had made this kind of visit before. It is, within a particular stratum of the music industry, a recognized professional function, attending in person to conversations that cannot be delegated to correspondence because the correspondence has begun to go unanswered. The tone of such visits is almost always courteous. The substance is almost always a form of accounting that the recipient already knows is coming, but has not yet fully accepted. What passed between the two women during those 2 hours has never been confirmed by anyone who was inside the room. What is known is the quality of the silence that followed, the changed register of Margaret's presence in the house in the days after, and the specific phone call she made within 24 hours of the representative's departure. She called a solicitor, not the one who had advised her on the recording agreements, whose relationship with her had become complicated in ways that had made her reluctant to extend it. This was a different solicitor, recommended to her months earlier by a musician who understood the landscape of intellectual property and who had watched similar situations resolve in ways that left artists with nothing but a name they no longer controlled. Margaret reached that solicitor from a phone in a part of the house where the home telephone system did not cover the signal. The conversation with the solicitor lasted almost 3 hours, extraordinary by any measure, and suggesting that Margaret had a great deal to communicate and a pressing understanding that she had limited time in which to communicate it. What she was doing in those 3 hours was building a legal structure around her final recordings that was designed to outlast her, to function after she could no longer function, to ensure that the instructions she was leaving behind would be enforceable by someone entirely outside the hierarchy of people who had been managing her affairs. She was, in the most precise legal sense, changing the terms of her own final chapter. After 2.5 years of being cared for, managed, filtered, and enclosed within a world that other people had constructed around her, she was choosing the shape of her own ending, in the only language that could guarantee it would be heard. Did it work? The answer to that question depends entirely on what you believe has happened to those recordings in every year since. Kay found the cottage by following a thread that should not have been there to follow, a recurring charge on a bank statement that had passed through her hands during the estate administration process, a charge for a coastal property lease that appeared month after month in records going back almost 2 years before Margaret's death. The property address meant nothing to her at first. She drove to it anyway, because driving to things had become her method of processing a grief too large and too structurally complicated to be managed from a distance. She parked outside the weatherboard cottage and sat in the car for several minutes, looking at the narrow porch, the untended garden, the absolute ordinariness of a place that had somehow remained invisible to everyone who had been positioned closest to Margaret's final years. Then she used the key she had found with the lease records. She went inside. She did not come out for 4 hours. The cottage held books Margaret had loved since she was young. Novels, alongside medical journals and treatment guides, the kind of clinical literature a patient consults when they need to understand their own condition with more precision than any summary can provide. There was a small upright piano with handwritten sheets propped against the music stand, notation that read less like finished composition and more like musical thinking worked out in pencil. Intervals and phrases and chord sequences from someone exploring something rather than completing it. There were journals, not diaries in the conventional sense, but something more deliberate. Volumes with dated entries that read like dispatches from an interior world Margaret had apparently needed to document with a consistency and honesty she could not maintain in any other form of communication available to her during those years. Kay read those journals in the shifting afternoon light, and what she encountered in them changed her understanding of her sister's final chapter so completely that she has never been able to speak about them without very careful preparation. The journals were not only a record of suffering, though suffering was present throughout them. They were a record of precise, unsentimental thinking, an intelligence working through the implications of everything that was happening to and around Margaret, naming things that had not been named in any conversation Kay had ever been able to have with her, and naming them with a directness that made clear Margaret had always possessed this clarity, and had simply chosen, for reasons that made painful sense once you understood the full architecture of her life, not to deploy it where anyone might act on it in ways she could not control. In the final entries, Margaret wrote about the recordings specifically, not about their commercial fate, not about the legal questions surrounding them, but about what she hoped they might eventually accomplish, which was simply to reach the people who had loved her music and to confirm for them that she had not drifted away, that she had not chosen silence, that she had kept singing until she no longer could. What do you do when you discover that the person you loved most was more fully alive in secret than in the life you were allowed to share with them, and that the secret was not betrayal, but the only form of freedom they had left? George left the family home within 8 months of Margaret's death. He relocated quietly, without announcement, and the relocation was accompanied by a settlement of the estate that Kay contested through legal channels for almost 3 years. The contest resolved without reaching a courtroom, which means the specific terms of what was agreed remain confidential. What is known, from people familiar with the proceedings, is that Kay secured rights she had not previously held, rights relating to the archive, to the handling of Margaret's name and likeness, and to materials whose exact nature was never publicly specified, but which those familiar with the case believe include copies of at least some of the final recordings. George received the financial portion of the estate. He has not spoken publicly about Margaret since relocating. He has declined, through representatives, every request for comment that has reached him in the years since. And that silence, chosen freely by a man with no illness to fight and no prison of protection to inhabit, contains its own kind of answer. Whether George was a villain in the way this story might be expected to produce a villain is a question that resists a comfortable answer. He did not invent the illness. He did not create the contractual architecture that claimed ownership of Margaret's final creative act. He did not design the industry that extracted from her everything it could extract, and then sent a business affairs representative to make sure nothing had been overlooked. What he did was make choices, under conditions of extreme financial pressure and intimate grief, that prioritized certain things over other things, that prioritized a particular version of dignified privacy over the transparency that might have allowed Margaret to make fully informed decisions about the shape of her own ending. These are not the choices of someone monstrous. They are the choices of a person who found himself in an impossible position and navigated it in ways that served some people better than others. But the person who paid the highest price for that navigation was the one person whose interests he had promised, above all others, to protect. Kay has become, in the years since her sister's death, the primary keeper of a legacy whose full shape she is still in the process of determining. She has not rushed. She has not published. She has not confirmed or denied the existence of the recordings in any statement that reaches beyond her closest circle. What she has done is live with what she knows, and use that knowledge to orient herself toward a version of her sister's story that honors what the journals told her Margaret actually valued, which was not, in the end, the platinum records or the arena performances or the commercial machinery that had made her name. It was the singing itself, the moment of direct transmission between a voice and a listener, the thing that everything else in her career had been built around, and that nothing, not illness or financial pressure or the managing intentions of the people who loved her, had ever been able to fully take away. The mystery of the final recordings is likely to remain a mystery for years, perhaps for the rest of the lives of most people who care enough to want its resolution. Legal structures built to outlast their authors do outlast their authors. The trustee Margaret appointed in those final weeks continues, apparently, to operate according to instructions designed with patience in mind, with the understanding that the right moment for certain truths is not necessarily the first moment that their release becomes technically possible. Somewhere, in a vault or on a hard drive or in a set of carefully maintained audio files, a voice exists, singing the songs that were made when the woman who sang them knew she was dying and wanted to leave behind something that was purely and entirely hers. Whether that voice ever reaches the people who have been waiting for it, the people who loved her without knowing there was something to wait for, is the question that no account of this story can answer. Only time answers that kind of question. And time, as Margaret Urlich understood better than most, takes exactly as long as it needs to. Friends, if you have stayed with this story to its end, then you already understand that Margaret Urlich was not a singer who retired quietly and faded into memory. She was a woman who fought one of the hardest battles a human being can fight, and she fought it in a silence so complete that the people who had loved her music for years spent the entire duration of that battle not knowing it was happening. Now you know. And the question that only you can answer, the one we want to hear your response to in the comments, is this. Do you believe Margaret was right to protect her privacy the way she did, to carry the weight of what was happening to her without asking anyone outside that silence to share it? Or do you believe that the silence, however carefully constructed and however lovingly intended, was its own form of loss? A final chapter written without the witnesses who might have helped her carry what she chose to carry alone. Tell us in the comments below. Tell us whether Margaret's name still means something in your part of the world. Tell us if her music was part of your life, if you were among the people who assumed she had simply drifted away, and who feel now something much closer to grief than you expected to feel. Like this video if you believe the truth is always worth finding, even when it takes 30 months or 30 years to finally reach the people it was always meant to find. And subscribe so the next story we tell reaches you before the silence does.